Good morning and welcome to the Core Connection. I'm Mira Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is exercising freedom through choice. The ability to choose our state, our perspective, our beliefs is the foundation of our freedom. And so often we don't actually choose. We inherit ideas, we adopt ideas of the popular culture, often without examination. But when we exercise our freedom to choose, we actually take back our power and our sovereignty. So that's what we're going to talk about this morning. But before we get started, let's take a minute or two to get present. Let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing all your cells, all your organs, bringing life energy to your body and being. And as you exhale any tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light, lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, electrifying, and energizing all your cells, your molecules, your electrons, creating a brilliant beam of light and energy from your heart out into the world. And as you exhale any remaining tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take another deep breath. Actually, let's press our palms together and vigorously rub your hands together to feel the friction, the temperature, the pressure, the motion, the tickling and tingling when you stop. And allow all those sensations to bring you present right here, right now, into this remarkable physical form that enables us to experience life. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Good morning, Rosalind. Welcome. So good to have you here with us this morning. And welcome to everybody else who's joining us. Today, we're talking about exercising freedom through choice. And I think that the choices that we have available to us are something that we take for granted and often overlook and don't actually embrace actively. And I think that were we to do so, were we to actively engage in choice, that we would experience much greater self-empowerment, much greater sense of sovereignty in our own lives. So this goes to a very simple and fundamental level, actually, where we can be looking at a choice as simple as, how do I choose to interact with my thoughts? How do I choose to interact with my emotions? What do I prefer in this moment? So it's very interesting. I had a very interesting interaction with a client yesterday, and this is a person who has really struggled quite a lot in their lives with regard to kind of obsessive thinking. And I don't think that that's unusual. I think a lot of us have at least gone through periods where we just keep running the same thought over and over and over. And It feels like it's being done to us. It feels like we're at the effect of that thought or a feeling, and this endless loop that just continually replays. And when we have the ability, and that's maybe a moment of grace actually, to have the ability to step away from the loop, to actually recognize the loop rather than to be in it, to recognize it, to be able to step back from it and see it. That's maybe the grace. Once we have the ability to step back from it and see it, then we can have the ability to choose how we interact with it. So we can, when we step back and see it, we can say, oh, isn't that interesting? We can engage curiosity. We can actually make choices because we're not in the vortex of that, the pull of that looping thought or pattern. And so when we exercise that choice, we can say, oh, how do I choose to interact with this thought? Because we're not our thoughts, although we often believe that we are. We are not really even subject to them unless we allow that. So we can stand back and say, oh, isn't that interesting? We can cultivate curiosity. The first step to freedom is choice, like getting to the place where, or recognition. I guess the first step to freedom is awareness, and then choice. So when we can become aware, and I find that this does happen, that we're in a loop, and then there's a moment of recognizing, oh my gosh, I'm in a loop. And then we have the opportunity to exercise our choice and our sovereignty. What I mean by sovereignty is our independence from these thoughts or patterns. That the one thing that we have the ability to shift and change and transform is the way we think, the way we think, the way we feel, our beingness. This is a place where we can exercise choice. And so when these loops occur, they're very powerful. And to extricate ourselves from them sometimes takes some effort, to first realize it's just a thought. And when we can recognize that we are not our thoughts, we have thoughts, or sometimes they pass through. Like sometimes it's not even our thoughts. It feels like it's not even our thoughts, that it's something that glommed onto us or that we glommed onto. But just because there's a thought doesn't mean that we have to believe it, doesn't mean that we have to run with it, doesn't mean that we have to give it credibility or attention necessarily either. So if you think about it, the way that I was talking about it in our conversation yesterday was like, if you're at Kmart, for example, in the background, there's the speakers saying, attention Kmart shoppers. It doesn't mean you have to pay attention to it. Doesn't mean you have to give it weight. You can notice a thought and just let it go by. It's not something that you have to ascribe meaning to. And I think that's a it's an important distinction, an important thing to recognize is that just because we have a thought doesn't mean that it's worthy of our attention. And we can notice it and let it go by. So the freedom of choice, and really in any given moment, we have the opportunity to choose a response. So for instance, there may be a moment where something happens and the knee-jerk reaction is to get angry. If we have the grace, and I know it's a big if, but if we have the grace to take a breath in that moment of breath, that pause, we have the opportunity then to choose. And so we can just react, or maybe we can choose differently, to choose to respond rather than react. Perhaps we have, in that breath, in that moment of pause, the opportunity to say, do I really want to go down that road? Does that serve me? Does it serve my intentions? Is it aligned with my values? Is it who I want to be, or how I want to feel? And really, truly, we do in any moment have the opportunity to choose how do we want to feel, because we can create any state pretty much in any moment. We just don't exercise that opportunity. So I could be angry over something and reactive and get swept up in that vortex. And that's actually appealing to a lot of people a lot of times, because it's a familiar place, because there's certain chemical sets that get released in those states that are familiar, but that are also like vitalizing, even if they're not necessarily what we would call positive. They're energizing, vitalizing, being angry, being righteous, whatever. And we actually can choose. And even after we've started going down that road, we can recognize it and step back and maybe even be curious, or maybe even find some humor in the fact that we were so reactive. And humor, curiosity, playfulness are all ways that we can diffuse, transform a path and exercise our freedom, literally our freedom to not have to be at the effect of these reactions. So I was speaking with someone who was very upset about certain circumstances, and the story they were creating about circumstance involving another person. They were just working themselves into a lather. And I think we've all done it at one time or another, where we just get on a rant, we go barreling down this track of a runaway train. And at one point, I said, how about if we put our attention on things we can control? And the one thing that we can control, we can't control other people. We can't control what they say, what they do, how they think. But what we can exercise our control over, or our choice over, is how we choose to respond, and also where we choose to focus. So by directing our attention, we are exercising choice. And I want to put forth that our own well-being and our own state of being is one of the, if not the, most powerful and treasured capacities and capabilities that we have. Good morning, Sue. So good to have you joining us. And Rosalind says, question struggling to answer. Is it true? What to replace the question with? So the question of whether, is it true? I don't know that is it true is necessarily an answerable question if we really look at it. So why not look at a question that's going to generate some kind of beneficial state or response? So maybe how would I prefer to feel? Or what would best serve right now? Or how can I elevate my state? Or what am I choosing in this moment? Because I think for the most part, this question of is it true generates a very subjective answer, not an empirical answer. But is it true is something that I'm assessing from my vantage point and my perspective, which is very conditioned or very subjective. You know, in this moment, I can make up a whole story about another person, and it's true for me in that moment. It may not be factually true. It may not be true from the vantage point of the other person. It may not even be true from my vantage point at another space and time. If I shift my perspective, then whatever that story was becomes questionable. So the question of whether something is true or not is maybe not the most relevant question. Because it's so interesting how when we recognize, and this is something that I recognize more and more vividly all the time, is how malleable reality is, how malleable, at the very least, our experience of reality is. When we recognize that, the question, is it true, becomes a relative question. And maybe like, what am I present to in this moment would be more useful. Because it's funny, when I've found myself in those loops, part of it is trying to justify my vantage point. So if I'm angry with somebody, or angry at myself even, the story that I create is kind of self-perpetuating. It's self-validating, and I'll make a whole case and justify, and it's trying to make it more and more true. But in a heartbeat, that perspective can shift, and then what was so obviously true a minute ago is no longer true. I think what we're talking about here is taking responsibility for the quality of our experience and our reality. To recognize that just because we think it's one way doesn't mean that that's the way it is. You know, just because I think something's true doesn't necessarily make it true. It may be true for me in that moment, but that, you know, that perspective is really quite variable. You know, where we experience blaming other people, it's your fault, you did this to me, whatever. And when we point the finger, classically, right? When you point the finger, how many fingers are pointing back at you, right? What does that mean? It's that we are actively engaged in creating our reality and our experience. Actively, maybe not consciously, but actively engaged. And so becoming more aware of that gives us power to shift it and transform it and and create it. It's easy to fall into a trap of victimhood where the world is doing us dirt in one way or another, or a person is, or whatever. When we rise to the the ability to respond rather than react, when we look at the part that we play in something, in a circumstance, it gives us back our power. It gives us back an opportunity to shift things, to change things. And I think that power is paramount to maintain our, just the best word that I know is sovereignty. You know, to take ownership for our lives. And it's not to say that people aren't victimized. There are circumstances where we are victimized. There's no question about that. And I'm not justifying that, and I'm not laying blame about that. And we get to choose whether to be victims or not, whether to step into the role of victim. So it's kind of learning how to hold this, not necessarily paradox, but holding contradiction, right? To be able to be ultimately responsible, and also to know that it's that perhaps we were victimized, but we don't have to be victims. And so what does that mean? What does it mean um, to be responsible and to act accordingly, to this was a great question that I encountered with someone the other day, between like, what is justice? What is justice, and how do you navigate this notion of justice in the face of personal accountability? You know, like, if I'm responsible in my life and something happens, what, and I can see even my role in that, but somebody else did wrong. How do we navigate that? It's tricky waters. But circling or back around to this notion of choice, we do have an ability to choose our feelings, to choose our experience, to choose our perspective. And while we want to honor our process and honor the emotions, the experiences that we have, we also have the ability to direct that experience. And finding that balance and taking ownership of it is a deep source of personal empowerment. So that's it for today. I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection. And I go live here each weekday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page and YouTube channel. And I invite you to please like, follow, and share Enlightened World Network and me. The links are in the description. And as always, it's such a deep pleasure and privilege to have the opportunity to muse together about what it is to be human. So